Assalamu alaikum friends. I'm Taqdeer Siddiqui with Computer Graphics for Bachelor's in Computer Science course being offered by Virtual University Government of Pakistan. We have started our odyssey with graphics and currently we are talking about lightings. We have talked about some of the basic ideas. We are going to continue our discussion about lighting and shading, and today we shall be talking about some interaction of light with material surfaces, because that is what gives life to our objects in the model. So let's begin with the light and material surfaces. So as I said, initially we have been talking about light, what light is, how colors are composed, the RGB thing, and what is the interaction between a light and a surface. Today we are going to specifically look at what different surfaces do or behave like when light is thrown on them. We are going to see objects as a result of interaction between the light and the surface of the object. So we will be going slightly into deeper details of this interaction today. In order to understand how an object's color is determined, we'll need to understand the parts that come into play to create that final color. The first, the thing that we need to know is that the source of illumination, which is typically in the form of the light source in our scene, that we need to know and understand. And the second thing, that is the material, the surface that it interacts with in order to create a view. Lights can also have attenuation, which means that their intensity is a function of the distance from the light to the surface. For instance, if we have a light source which is near to our object, definitely it is going to have a different intensity on that object's surface. और अगर हमारा light source दूर चला जाए तो उस light की intensity on the object of interest, that would be decreased. So that we need to keep in mind and keep in view. तो जब हम calculations कर रहे होते हैं कि किस लाइट का क्या इम्पैक्ट होगा, किस तरह के ऑब्जेक्ट को वो दिखा रही होगी, उसके ऊपर से लाइट रिफ्लेक्ट कितनी ज़्यादा या कितनी कम हो रही होगी, उसके अंदर एक फैक्टर जो है वो ये एटेन्यूएशन का भी है, जिसको जहन में रखना होगा. लाइट्स कैन एडिशनली बी गिवन अदर प्रॉपर्टीज सच एज अ शेप एंड पोजिशन. व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट शेप ऑफ लाइट, वी कैन टॉक अबाउट अ स्पॉटलाइट एज अपोज टू another source of light which is spreading light all over the scene evenly. Spotlight क्या करेगी? किसी एक specific object के ऊपर हम throw कर रहे होंगे उस light को, and that light is going to have a different impact on that object and a different impact on the surrounding areas of the scene, because naturally वो spotted होगी on a specific area or on a specific object of our model. लेकिन अगर हम एक ऐसे लाइट सोर्स की बात करते हैं जो कि स्पॉटेड नहीं है, वो इवनली स्प्रेड कर रहा है, तो उस लाइट सोर्स के ऑन करने के नतीजे में, उसको यूज़ करने के नतीजे में ओवरऑल सीन के जो तमाम ऑब्जेक्ट्स हैं या हमारे मॉडल के तमाम ऑब्जेक्ट्स हैं, उनके ऊपर एक डिफरेंट इम्पैक्ट नज़र आएगा. और बिल्कुल इसी तरह से पोजिशन ऑफ द लाइट वुड ऑल्सो बिकम इम्पॉर्टेंट. इज द लाइट पोजिशनड इन सच अ मैनर दैट इट इज द लाइट इटसेल्फ, द लाइट सोर्स दैट वी आर अबाउट टू यूज एंड शो, वो पार्ट ऑफ द सीन है or it is away from it? Is it near to our objects or it is far away? So that is also going to play a role and have an impact on the way our objects appear in a scene. But that's more in the implementation rather than the mathematics of the lighting effects. So we are going to concentrate on the mathematics part yet. जब हम implementation की तरफ आएंगे तो naturally इन तमाम चीज़ों को इस्तेमाल कर रहे होंगे, but then we would be more concerned about taking care कि हमने क्या दिखाना है और उसको कैसे दिखाना है. Two types of phenomena are important in lighting calculations that we need to consider, that we will be using. The first is the interaction of light with the surface boundary. The most primitive one. We have indirectly talked about it. Today we are going to go into the details of this. And the second one is the effect of light as it gets absorbed, transmitted, and scattered by interacting with the actual material itself. And this is the topic of today's lecture. आज हमने यही देखना है कि लाइट के डिफरेंट सोर्सेज किस तरीके से डिफरेंट मटेरियल्स की सर्फेसेस के साथ इंटरैक्ट करते हैं. बाउंड्री इंटरैक्शन जो बेसिक आइडिया है वो तो हम पहले भी ले चुके हैं कि किस तरह से कलर ऑफ लाइट और कलर ऑफ द सरफेस ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट वो आपस में इंटरैक्ट करते हैं. लेकिन अभी हम ये भी जानना चाहेंगे कि डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ सर्फेसेस के साथ इंसिडेंट लाइट क्या सलूक करती है. नाउ डिपेंडिंग अपॉन द नेचर ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट that the light is being thrown on, it can behave differently. You may have an object which is very shiny. We may have an object which is very dull. The light is going to behave differently on the surfaces of these two different objects. And this is what we would like to explore in greater depth today. We are going to talk about different types of materials from their nature's point of view, the way they reflect light off their surface. And that would be very imperative in calculation of the final view that we have from a scene as a result of a specific incident light on a specific material surface that we are showing in our scene. Materials are typically richer in their description in an effort to mimic the effects seen in real life, light material surface interaction. The nature of the materials that we are going to talk about could be opaque, could be transparent as well, but itself the surface that defines the object, that is a richer thing than the light. Light is essential to be there in order to show us the surface, but itself the material that composes that object, that is richer in nature. Materials are typically described using 2 or 4 separate colors in an effort to catch the nuances of real-world light material surface interactions. Those 4 things we are going to talk about now. Now these colors are the ambient, diffuse, specular, and emissive colors, with ambient and specular typically frequently grouped together, and emissive specified only for the objects that generate light themselves. As we were talking about earlier, that if there is going to be a light source shown as part of our scene, that is where the concept of emissive colors would be coming in or working in. But otherwise, we'll be making use of the other 3. The reason there are different colors is to give different effects arising from different environmental causes. The most common lights are going to be discussed now. Whenever we are talking about some specific scene, there can be many different sources of light. In general, when there is no specific spotlight or a specific natured light used in a scene, there is the concept of a prevailing environmental light which helps us see the scene the way it appears without any specific particular light in there. So that is also one of the considerations that we are going to have. And then if we have a specific light, तो उसके add करने से different parts of the scene के ऊपर क्या impact आ रहा है, क्या उनका effect आ रहा है, that would also be noted, and we'll have to perform calculations to reflect that interaction. So whenever we have maybe the real life light source, the sun, and it is illuminating our scene all over, this is going to be a different scenario. And if our sun is only peeping through maybe a window pane and only a part of the rays is walking into our room and is illuminating only part of the scene, this is going to be a different light, of course. So we will be taking care of all these different scenarios in which we have different sources of light from the environment affecting different parts of our view or scene differently. The ambient lighting, that's the first that we are going to talk about. As I said earlier, that ambient light is one of the basic 4 colors that we are going to use for describing the light surface interaction. The very concept of ambient light is that this is not dependent upon any specific source. This is the prevailing, natural prevailing light in a scene, and in that light we try to estimate or kind of at times guesstimate the color of the objects that are in the scene. So we would be estimating color of an object depending upon what is the nature of that object, what surface it is. Is it a metallic surface or is it some other refractive surface? Keeping those considerations in mind, we would be calculating the basic illumination available, prevailing in any given environment, and that would be ambient light. Now this is the color of the object when there is no particular light, just the general environmental illumination, and that would give us the basic color for the objects in the scene. The ambient light is an approximation of the global illumination in the environment and relies upon no specific light in the scene. The next is diffuse lighting. The diffuse light is the light of the surface if the surface were perfectly matte. A matte surface is the one that is not a shiny one, does not reflect everything. It is a rough surface, but it reflects light quite evenly. So when that kind of a surface is there, we are going to make use of the concept of a diffused light, because the object that would be under consideration will have a surface which would be evenly spreading the light in all directions, and that is what the concept of a diffused light is. The diffused light is reflected in all directions from the surface and depends only on the angle of the light to the surface normal. Whenever we have some object, the object surface normal and the incident light, what angle they make, that is what determines what kind of diffused light we are going to have for that very surface of object. The next one is specular lighting. The specular light mimics the shininess of a surface, and its intensity is a function of the light's reflection angle of the surface. So whenever some incident light is shown or thrown on a specific shiny object, now naturally it is going to reflect. It would be reflecting all or most part of the light, and that would be giving us a shiny effect or shining surface effect, and that kind of light would be known as a specular light. These are the lights that we are going to make use of in order to have different effects on objects in our scene. And last but not the least is the emissive lighting. Emissive lighting is used wherever we have the concept of some object in our environment which would be behaving like a source of light. If an object is required to glow, it is required to give the impact as if it is glowing, then we'll make use of the concept of emissive light. And such would be used whenever we want to show some light source, or we want to give glowing effect for some reason or the other to any object available in our scene. So this is just an additional color source added to the final light of the object, since the concept is that we want the glowing effect to be given to an object. Because we are simulating an object giving off its own light as if it is emitting it, generating it, we still add a real light to get an effect on the objects in the scene. Because when that object which we want to appear as glowing object, that would glow, naturally it would generate light, and that light has to have an impact on the surrounding of that object in the scene, and that will have to be compensated for using another light source that would be dispersing light around that object on the environment of that object. So whatever would be there in the surroundings of that object would also get illumination from that emissive light given to that specific object. So before we get into exactly what these types of lightings and what they are and what they are going to do, let's put it in the perspective for our purpose of writing the shader code. We want to generate that code which would be able to do the shading part, the light and shade concept. So let's talk about those factors that contribute towards the making of that shader. Shading is simply calculating the color reflected off a surface, which is pretty much what our shaders do. So that's what we want to do now, that whatever the light source may be, when it gets reflected off a specific surface, what impact that gives, that we would like to calculate and make use of in the making of our scenes. When a light reflects off a surface, the light colors are modulated by the surface color, and this thing we have already seen. We have seen when light is incident on a specific surface, हमने उनके RGB components के हवाले से ये basic analysis करके देखा था. a couple of lectures back कि जिसके अंदर हमने ये कहा था कि अगर रेड, ग्रीन और ब्लू कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ द इंसिडेंट लाइट्स हैं उनकी स्पेसिफिक वैल्यूज ये हों और जो सरफेस है उसके ऊपर जो आरजीबी कलर वैल्यूज हैं वो ये हों, तो इन दोनों की इंटरेक्शन के नतीजे में हमें क्या दिखाई देगा. वी डिड डिस्कस दिस कॉन्सेप्ट एट लेंथ. सो दिस इज द प्रिमिटिव थिंग दैट वी वुड बी doing when we are talking about calculating what is shown as the final color for the object. Modulation means multiplication, and for colors, since we are using the RGB values, the red, green and blue values or red, green and blue components, this means that component by component multiplication would be done. Can you recall? We have talked about this component by component multiplication earlier on as well. When we said that okay, light source has got RGB components, surface has got RGB components, and when they interact, this modulation or in the form of multiplication would be actually a component by component multiplication. First, red component of the light would get multiplied by the red component of the surface, and that resultant would be stored, and similarly green and blue components would positionally get multiplied, and that would be resulting in the modulated colors. So for the light source L, let it be L for the moment, with color RL, GL and BL shining on a surface S with color RS, GS, BS, the resulting color R would be calculated as R equals L component by component multiplied by S. You can see that the same symbol that we discussed earlier on, that is being used over here, a cross which is encircled, and this is not simple multiplication, this is symbolizing that component by component multiplication of the two L and S, all three factors R, G and B. So on multiplying, what we are going to get is that RL would get multiplied by RS, the light red component would get multiplied by the surface's red component. Similarly, GL, GS, green component of light multiplied by the green component of the surface, and blue component of light multiplied by the blue component of the surface. And this would be the component by component multiplication, which would be carried out in order to generate the value, final value for R, where the resulting RGB values of the light and surface are multiplied out to get the final colors, which are the RGB values. The final step after calculating all the lighting contributions is to add together all the lights to get the final color. So typically a shader would be doing something like this. Number one, it would calculate the overall ambient light on a surface. You can recall what the ambient light concept is? Yeah, it's the natural prevalent environmental light. No specific light source employed, basic ambient light. So first of all, that would be calculated. Second step would be that for each light in a scene, calculate the diffuse and specular contributions for each light. So for any and every light that is there in the scene, calculate these two. And this is when we said that we will be grouping them together, the specular and the diffuse lights. So second step would be that for each and every light in a scene, we calculate the diffuse and specular contribution for each of the lights. Third step, calculate any emissive light for a surface. So wherever there is requirement or there is a scene requirement that we come up with glowing effect for a specific object in the scene, we will be calculating the emissive light for that surface. And fourth step would be to add all these lights together to calculate the final color value. You see, basic idea is the same. Whenever light and surface are interacting, तो मॉड्यूलेशन हो रही है, वो कॉन्सेप्ट अपनी जगह पे मौजूद है, लेकिन कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी सिर्फ इस हवाले से ऐड हो रही है कि ज़रूरी नहीं है कि जिस ऑब्जेक्ट के बारे में हम ये तय करना चाह रहे हैं कि उसको किस कलर में शो करना है, किस कलर में डिस्प्ले किया जाना है, उस पर लाइट सिर्फ एक ही पड़ रही हो. जैसे अभी हम बात कर रहे थे कि अगर किसी ऑब्जेक्ट पर कोई स्पेकुलर लाइट थ्रो नहीं भी की जा रही, उसके बराबर में कोई और ऑब्जेक्ट है जो कि एमिसिव लाइट बिहेव कर रहा है या उसको हम एमिट कराता हुआ दिखा रहे हैं लाइट को, तो फिर उसकी एमिसिव लाइट जो है वो इस बराबर वाले ऑब्जेक्ट को भी इफेक्ट कर रही होगी. सो एनी एंड एवरी लाइट दैट इज known to contribute towards the color of any object that has to be accounted for. So इन चारों different तरह की lights का की calculation करने के बाद finally what we do is we add the effect of all these and then we come up with that final color which can be used for displaying objects in that scene. In the real world we get some sort of interaction, kind of reflection or something, when a photon interacts with a surface boundary. And this is when we get to see things. Basic phenomena जो है चीज़ों को हमारे देखने का वो ये है ना. So whenever a photon interacts with a surface boundary, we have certain visible objects there. Thus we see the effects not only when we have a transparent to opaque boundary, like in case of air to plastic, but also a transparent to transparent boundary, like from air to water. So we have to keep in mind and take care of all these things. And you will be getting to have a feel that now mathematics is still there, but physics is all the more walking into it. We have to know these basics. We have read about all these. We'll be making use of those basic concepts over here in order to come up with intelligent models that help us model and then render and rasterize our scenes in a better fashion. The key feature here is that we get some visual effect when a photon interacts with some boundary between two different materials. As I said earlier as well, that we get to see objects as a result of this interaction of photon with these surfaces. So that's what we have to know and we have to keep in mind when we are talking about generating the final view of the objects. Now we'll see that the nature of objects, like conductivity of an object, that is going to have a specific effect on how that object looks when finally some specific light is thrown on it, or even when it is not. When light is thrown on conductors, for instance, typically metals, most part of the light gets reflected, whereas other objects which are non-conductors, they might reflect as well as refract light. There would be more part of light actually which would get either transmitted through their surface, get absorbed, or get dispersed in various directions. So we are going to take a look at these different behaviors of different types of surfaces and how light interacts with those surfaces. So the conductivity of materials directly affects how the photon is reflected. At the surface of a conductor, for instance, any metallic object, the light is mostly reflected, as I said. For dielectrics, that is non-conductors, there is usually more penetration and transmittance of light. For both kinds of materials, the dispersion of light is a function of the roughness of the surface. This has to be dealt with separately. We are talking about metals or conductors being more reflective surfaces, and non-conductors or dielectrics being lesser reflective surfaces, but the way light gets spread from the surface of the object is function of a different attribute of the surface, and that attribute is how rough is the surface. Regardless of it कि हम लोहे की बात कर रहे हैं या लकड़ी की बात कर रहे हैं, उसकी सरफेस कितनी ज़्यादा स्मूथ या कितनी ज़्यादा रफ है, that determines how the light gets dispersed off this surface. अगर किसी metallic object के ऊपर भी matte look है, the dispersion is going to be even. Similarly, अगर evenly rough surface होगी किसी भी dielectric surface की object की, तो उस सूरत में भी उसके ऊपर dispersion of light जो है वो evenly हो रही होगी. You can take a look at this picture. You can see how incident light behaves from a smooth and a rough conductor surface. Both the surfaces are those of conducting materials. आप assume कर लीजिए कि ये दोनों metallic objects ही की हमने examples ली हैं, लेकिन जो left side पे आपको दिखाई दे रहा है, that is a smooth surface, and you can see that light is getting reflected depending upon its angle of incidence in a specific direction. but when the surface of the object is pretty rough, you can clearly see that the reflection is not in a specific direction only, although most part is being reflected depending upon the angle of incidence of light on this surface, but you can always see other areas where the light gets dispersed because of the roughness of the surface. Smoother the surface, greater would be the reflection, lesser would be dispersion. Rougher the surface, there would be more dispersion, and of course naturally accordingly lesser reflection. Look at this one as well. This is the example of a dielectric material. Now dielectrics can also have smooth or rough surfaces. तो अगर एक नॉन कंडक्टर है हमारे पास और उसकी सरफेस बहुत स्मूथ है, तो उस सूरत में जो बेसिक फिनोमेनन है रिफ्लेक्शन का वो तो होगा ही यहाँ पर, लेकिन साथ ही साथ नेचर ऑफ ऑब्जेक्ट विच इज अ नॉन मेटालिक ऑब्जेक्ट कुड बी समथिंग लाइक अ वर्ड पीस, क्या होगा, देयर वुड बी द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ एब्जॉर्प्शन ऑफ लाइट एज वेल. दिस वुड गेट काइंड ऑफ ट्रांसमिटेड थ्रू द सरफेस ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट, it would be penetrated into the body of the object. So सारी की सारी लाइट जो है वो रिफ्लेक्ट नहीं हो रही है, बल्कि कुछ जो है वो एब्जॉर्ब भी हो रही है. सिमिलरली काउंटर पार्ट अगर ऐसे ही डायरेक्ट्रिक ऑब्जेक्ट की रफ सरफेस है, उसको अगर आप देखिए तो अगर रफ सरफेस वाला ऑब्जेक्ट होगा तो उस पर भी डिस्पर्शन भी हो रही है, रिफ्लेक्शन हो रही है लाइट की इन मल्टीपल डिफरेंट डायरेक्शंस, लेकिन उसी तरह से इन मल्टीपल डिफरेंट डायरेक्शंस इट इज बीइंग एब्जॉर्ब्ड इनटू द ऑब्जेक्ट एज वेल. सरफेस से कुछ पार्ट ऑफ लाइट जो है वो ट्रांसमिट हो रहा है थ्रू द बॉडी ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट, सो दैट इज वॉकिंग इनटू द surface of the dielectric object. So we will not be having as much of reflection in multiple directions causing the dispersion of light as would be there in a rough metallic surface. The simplest model assumes that the roughness of the surface is so fine that the light is dispersed equally in all directions as we have seen in the first case. Let us consider a thick colored lacquer surface. How would that behave? What do you perceive? Well, if there is some surface which has been coated with a thick layer of lacquer, now that is going to act different from another surface which has not been coated with the lacquer. Now lacquer is something which is going to allow light to pass through it, to get absorbed in it. First of all, the incident light is going to hit the surface, it is going to hit the lacquer surface. Partly it would be reflected, partly it would be refracted. Having been refracted, when it walks inside that layer of lacquer and reaches the surface of the object underneath, then that part of light which has been transmitted through the layer of lacquer would start behaving the way we have seen it behaving. अगर नीचे वाली surface जो है वो किसी डाइलेक्ट्रिक मटेरियल की surface है तो उसका बिहेवियर वैसा ही होगा जैसा हमने डाइलेक्ट्रिक के केस में देखा है. अगर वो मेटालिक surface है तो नेचुरली उसका बिहेवियर वैसा होगा जैसा मेटालिक surfaces के लिए हमने अभी देखा है. So, but the fact is that part of the light has been reflected off the top of the lacquer surface, the lacquer layer, but part of light has penetrated through that layer and has reached the top of the surface on which the lacquer paint was done. So, when we have a lacquer coated surface, the lacquer itself is transparent, but the suspended in the lacquer surface or lacquer coating are the pigments, reflective pigments, of which light is going to get reflected. So light would be reflected off the top of it, the surface of it, but it would be refracted as well. It would be bounced, it would be split, shifted or altered before it perhaps the remaining part of it hits the lower part of the surface. So this would be seen in our next figure that we are going to show, that how when we are talking about an incident light hitting a surface which has been lacquer coated, the light behaves, how it bounces and how it gets split and gets reflected multiple times, first from within the reflective pigment of the lacquer surface and then the surface lying underneath which has been lacquer coated. So we are going to have this effect of light reflection, refraction and dispersion seen in our next example, in which probably having been through that light surface, the lacquer surface, light would be hitting the lower surface and it could still get reflected from there and come out into the outer world from the surface. This picture that you are seeing right now is trying to mimic the same phenomenon. The subsurface scattering, which is typical of pigment saturated translucent coatings, is being shown in here. Yes, of course, this terminology that of the pigment saturated translucent coating is for the lacquer surface that we have just taken for example. So if the light is hitting that surface, part of the light is getting reflected and part is being refracted. And you can see when light walks in there, there are those pigments aligned on in that surface, the lacquer surface, which are also causing the reflection of that light partly internally and partly externally as well. And furthermore, the incident light could still go to the surface of the object and could get absorbed over there or could get transmitted as well. The metallic paint, brushed metal or velvet, these are the kind of materials for which we need to examine better models to try to represent these surfaces, because the surfaces that we have been talking about, maybe the conductors only and the dielectrics, लोहे की बात कर रहे हैं और लकड़ी की, आसान है, because we can calculate how the light would be getting reflected or refracted from the surface or get transmitted or get dispersed depending upon the nature of roughness or smoothness of the surface. But when we are talking about materials like, say, velvet, we have to be careful, because you see the wet-like effect that comes out of the velvet surfaces because of certain parts of the velvet surface totally reflecting the light and certain parts kind of totally absorbing the light. So in order to mimic those, we have to come up with some more intelligent models. The next figure would be showing what we get when we use multiple broad specular terms for multiple base colors combined with a more traditional shiny specular term. You can take a look at this picture. Now this is going to talk about how different lights would be used in order to come up with the final form of the object. Just keep in mind the four portions which have been labeled as A, B, C and D, starting from the top left corner where we have the first block or image, second one on the right, the third one is in the lower part of the scene towards left, and the fourth one on the right corner, lower right corner. Now this is the figure for simple shader to simulate some metallic paint. Over here you can see that A, the first part, that shows the two-tone paint shading. The two-tone paint shading pass results in what we have seen as the first picture. The first part of it, part A, that is going to give us what we have after the two-tone paint shading pass has been done. After that, in the second one, we are showing the specular sparkle shading pass only. And this is where you would be seeing that only a specific part of the object is reflecting most part of the light which has been put or incident on this object. Now having done with this specular sparkle shading pass, we move on to the next pass, which is environmental mapping pass, which takes care of what environment this object is in and how that environment is going to affect the look of the object. If there are going to be certain objects around this object of interest which are going to have their reflection on its surface, then those things have to be taken care of. If there is some other source of light surrounding this object and that is going to end up having a different impact on the look of this surface or this object's surface, that would be taken care of. And in the last one, we show that the final composite image in which we have accounted for all these light calculations that we have performed. Now there is also a high frequency normal perturbation that simulates the sparkle from a metallic flake pigment. As we can see, we can get something that looks particularly striking with a fairly simple model. We have seen all these models thus far in which the basic principle of calculation of interaction between the light and the surface of object is the same. We have been making use of the same idea, but making use of multiple of those light sources we can come up with some very spectacular scenes as well. So today we have talked about some basic concepts, some further advanced concepts, some interaction of light with different surfaces of objects, and depending upon the nature of the object that is being hit by the light, how it is going to reflect, how it is going to behave in our ultimate scene. So let's give a recap to whatever has been the proceeding of the day before we move on. So we started off by developing the basic concept that what we require in order to be able to start deciding about the colors of the objects in our scene. And we talked about that the first thing would be that we need to have the source of illumination, typically the light that is going to be there in our scene, which is going to help us decide about the color of the objects in the scene. And then we talked about what lights can have. Lights can have the concept of decreasing their intensity depending upon the distance from a specific object. So we said that this is another important thing that we will be taking care of when the intensity of the light is increasing or decreasing depending upon how far or how near that is to the object of interest. And then we said that lights can also have shape. They can be either spotlight or general light that spreads all over the whole scene, and their impact has to be noted and has to be accounted for accordingly. और फिर हमने बात की कि पोजीशन जो है लाइट्स की वो भी एक इम्पॉर्टेंट फैक्टर है. क्या वो लाइट जो है वो लोकल टू आवर सीन है, इज इट पार्ट ऑफ आवर सीन, और इट इज आउटसाइड द सीन, और इट इज ओनली बीइंग यूज्ड एज अ सोर्स ऑफ लाइट which is glowing, which is helping our objects get a different color or a different look depending upon the intensity of the light. And then we talked about the factors that contribute towards the making of the final color. The first one was that how we see objects is contributing by the first interaction of the light with the surface boundary. So this is an important thing that we talked about, that how we are going to talk about and register when light hits a specific object's surface, how it behaves, how it is going to be showing the colors of that object. And then we talked about the second aspect of the same issue, which was that what is the nature of the object on which the light is being incident. If the nature of object is a reflective one, naturally it is going to have a different look as a result of the same light. If the object is such that it is going to absorb most part of the light, it is going to have a different look. And the concept of light getting absorbed or getting transmitted or getting scattered off the surface of the object is next consideration that we have to keep in mind. And then we said that there are 4 different colors which are used to describe the object surfaces. These 4 colors we have talked about in detail, but just to recap, these have been the ambient, diffuse, specular and emissive. और हमने कहा था कि जो ambient light है, that is simply mimicking or is making use of the available environmental light. It is not dependent upon a specific source of light, but what it does is that it just estimates, approximates the light in the environment, and as a result of that light, what color should the object take. And then our next topic was about the diffuse light. And then we said that how we are going to have the concept of a light which is going to be absorbed as on the surface of the object, and how it is going to give a different look to an object. So a diffuse light which gets reflected off from the surface of the object in various directions gives us the impact of a light which is evenly dispersed depending upon the nature of the surface, depending on the roughness or the smoothness of the surface, or it is unevenly dispersed. So diffusing light is another measure, another type of color that helps us decide about the nature of the object on which the light is being incident and how it would be looking in our ultimate scene at the end of the day. And then we talked about the specular light concept. In specular light, we said that it mimics the shininess of the surface of the object, and it is basically its intensity is the function of the light's reflection angle on the surface. So if light is incident at a specific angle, it is going to have a different intensity, and if it is incident at another different angle, it may have a different intensity. So depending upon where we are looking at the object from and where the light source is and how it is being reflected off the surface, that is going to have a different impact. And this was about the specular lights. And then we discussed the last but not the least, the concept of emissive light, which was when we wanted some object of our scene to glow, to show as if it is generating a light of its own. And then we said that in such a scenario, we'll have to take care of not only the object which is being glowing, but also the light that it is generating, and is going to affect the way objects around that glowing object are going to behave in the scene ultimately. Because originally there is no light that is incident on, no additional light which is incident on the object surrounding this object of interest which is meant to glow, but as soon as it starts glowing, the light generated by this object will affect the scene around it. So that will have to be taken care of, as we said. And we talked about this emissive light being only an additional source of color being added to the object of interest. The color of the object has been already calculated depending upon all other prevailing factors, and now if the glowing effect needs to be added, we just add another color, and that final light decides about the final emissive color of the object. And then we discussed what would be the concept of shading, and we said that shading is simply the calculation of color reflected off a surface. And then we discussed modulation, and in modulation we said that modulation is simply multiplication, and we have visited this concept earlier on as well, that whenever we have certain values which are required to be modulated, if the color value of the light and the color value of the surface of the object, they are described using the RGB components, then their modulation would be requiring some positional multiplication or component by component multiplication of those components. If light has the components R, G and B, and so has the surface of the object, then their modulation would require that the R, G and B components of both get positionally multiplied. Red component of light gets multiplied by the red component of the surface, green with the green, blue with the blue, and ultimately what we get would be the resulting color or what needs to be displayed. And we did discuss earlier on as well that whenever this modulation is performed, we end up having at times oversaturated values, and we have talked about earlier on the methods of controlling this phenomenon of oversaturation of colors. Now the final step after calculating all the lighting contributions that we studied, that it is to add together all the lights that get the final, in order to get the final color, that contribute towards the final color of the object. And so the shader that we are talking about, the routine or the code that would be generated later on to help us shade a specific object or mimic the picture, the view of the object in presence of all these different types of lights, that would require to do certain steps that we talked about. Those steps were 4 to be precise. The first one would be to calculate the overall ambient light on a surface, and this was without considering any other source of light but the basic environmental light only. And then we said that the next step would be that we calculate the diffuse and the specular contribution of lights, and having done with these two, we have already talked about these two different types of colors being coupled or grouped together. And that is where we talk about them, about these two, diffuse and the specular color, being together, and their contributions are calculated as a single step. And then if there are any emissive objects, we calculate that. If emissive light is supposed to be associated with an object or the other. So that would be the next step to be done. And having done with all these color calculations, the final step would be to add all lights together to form the final color, the final color that would be used in display of the object or making of the scene that we are targeting. And then we talked about interaction between light and different types of surfaces of objects takes place. In that we took the example of some conducting materials as well as some non-conducting materials. Conducting materials जैसा कि metals, उनके केस में हमने ये देखा कि depending upon the surface, if it is smooth or if it is rough, we can have different behavior of the incident light. अगर हमारे ऑब्जेक्ट की सरफेस जो है मेटालिक ऑब्जेक्ट की या कंडक्टिंग ऑब्जेक्ट की वो स्मूथ है, तो स्मूथ सरफेस के ऊपर से लाइट ऑलमोस्ट पूरी रिफ्लेक्ट हो जाएगी. एंड डिपेंडिंग अपॉन द एंगल ऑफ इंसिडेंस ऑफ लाइट, एंगल ऑफ रिफ्लेक्शन कैन बी मेजर्ड. बट अगर सरफेस जो है वो स्मूथ ना हो, रफ हो, तो रफ सरफेस के ऊपर क्या कॉन्सेप्ट होता है कि लाइट जो है वो फिर डिस्पर्स होना शुरू हो जाती है. द लाइट कैन डिस्पर्स फ्रॉम द रफ सरफेस, और अगर रफ सरफेस भी इवनली रफ हो तो वो डिस्पर्शन इवन किस्म की होगी, और अगर वो unevenly rough होगी तो naturally dispersion would be uneven. But nevertheless, the concept is that from conducting material surfaces or from metallic surfaces, most part of the light gets reflected. And then we talked about certain other factors, like when light is going to hit non-conducting materials, तब क्या होता है, उसमें हमने ये देखा था कि रिफ्लेक्शन जो है वो अब कम हो जाती है और ट्रांसमिशन ऑफ लाइट थ्रू द बॉडी ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट वो बढ़ जाती है. जो हमारे डाइलेक्ट्रिक सब्जेक्ट्स हैं, लाइक वी कैन टॉक अबाउट मटेरियल्स लाइक स्टोन और मे बी वुड, तो उस सूरत में हमने देखा कि डिपेंडिंग अपॉन द सरफेस बीइंग स्मूदर और रफर, behavior is different, but nevertheless the concept of penetration of light into the object that gets introduced, and we have the concept of light which is partly reflected off the surface of the object and partly it is transmitted through the object itself, it gets absorbed in there. And definitely the partial absorption of light into the surface causes the surface to appear differently, the color has to change accordingly. And if we have a rough surface of a dielectric material, then there is going to be the concept of dispersion, but that dispersion would not be only in terms of the reflected light but also the transmitted or refracted light, that would also be transmitted at different angles and would be absorbed in that material. उसके बाद हमने एक और एक्सेप्शन की बात की थी, and that exception was कि अगर हमारे पास कोई सी सरफेस ऐसी है जिसको कि हमने लेकर कोट किया हुआ है या किसी ट्रांसल्यूसेंट मटेरियल से कोट किया हुआ है, तो उसके ऊपर अगर लाइट इंसिडेंट होगी तो उसकी क्या सूरत बनेगी. तो उसमें हमने ये कहा कि जो लाइट है दैट इज गोइंग टू वॉक थ्रू दिस ट्रांसल्यूसेंट सरफेस, बट एज पार्ट ऑफ द सरफेस इटसेल्फ वुड बी कंपोज्ड ऑफ सच पिगमेंट्स, सैचुरेटेड एरियाज विच वुड बी रिफ्लेक्टिंग लाइट. तो उस सूरत में भी ये हो रहा होगा कि रिफ्लेक्शन ऑफ लाइट वुड बी टेकिंग प्लेस फ्रॉम विद इन दैट लेकर सरफेस. So that was another concept, and then the surface being translucent of course would be allowing light to pass through it as well, and that would be partly going to the surface of the object as well, and depending upon how thick the layer of lacquer may be, we can have different reflection or different look of the object. And then we discussed how we can have multiple of these colors and their lighting calculations contributing towards the making of some spectacular scenes. So folks, let's call it a day. We have discussed interaction of light and different types of surfaces today, and we have talked about the making of more realistic images out of light and surface interaction, and we have talked about a model as well which helps us make use of all these basic colors, the diffuse, the ambient and the specular, in order to come up with the final form which can be made to appear as spectacular scenes in computer graphics. So folks, we have had enough of discussion on the subject, but still more is to go. We will continue talking about the light and different surfaces interaction, and we will continue to add more attributes and more complexities to this idea, and we'll try to come up with even maturer models that can help us mimic different scenes in a more realistic manner. The ultimate goal is that we should be able to make scenes as real as they appear in the real life. Although we cannot compete nature, but we definitely would be able to come up with closest possible results that we can generate with the available techniques so far. So next time, inshallah, we'll be continuing this subject and talking about more intricacies of the same subject. तब तक के लिए इजाज़त दीजिएगा. फ़ी अमान अल्लाह.